so much for joining us in this session.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm very flattered by your interest in my work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's quite unique here, a work on zombies. It's very unique.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so can we begin the session right away?
Yes, let's do it.
Yeah, okay. So let me introduce Dr. Sarah Juliet Lauro. She's an assistant professor of hemispheric literature at the University of Tampa. She's the author and editor of many works that address the figure of the living dead zombie in literary works and films, including the article A Zombie Manifesto, the book The Transatlantic Zombie, Slavery, Rebellion, and Living Death, and the collection Zombie Theory, a Reader. Her next book project turns from zombies as a figuration of slavery and slave revolt, which is her central interest in the monster, to commemorations of slave revolt in literature, art, film, and digital culture. So we welcome Professor Lauro, and let's dive right into the question, right into the session then. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, Dr. Lauro, let us directly look into the Haitian undead. When we see a zombie walk, how much historical load are we witnessing in that slowness?
Well, I think that I need to start by asking how familiar with the history of the zombie is your audience likely to be? Should we start with a little thumbnail sketch? There might be some people listening who have really never thought deeply about the zombie or where it comes from. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to start by giving a short little introduction.
I think that would be perfect. That would be perfect.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So most scholars who look into the history of the zombie know that it comes to U.S. cinema by way of the U.S. occupation of Haiti, which was from 1915 to 1934. And we know that the zombie was originally a folkloric figure of the reanimated dead that was put to work in the fields by a witch doctor who reanimated him or her. They then profited off the labor of the animate corpse. My own research in the transatlantic zombie actually traces the ancestors of this myth to African soul capture mythologies that are deeply from the beginning about slavery, and which likely came to the Caribbean on slave ships. But from there, the mythology continues to develop and evolve, and it takes on an especial resonance because of its association with Haiti, which is the only country in the world that was founded as the result of a slave uprising. Therefore, one important takeaway for me is that the zombie is always associated both with slavery and with slave rebellion. But one thing that I think is important to impress upon our students who have never really thought about zombies deeply is that the first waves of zombie cinema and in this folkloric iteration, zombies themselves were not terrifying creatures. They did not bite people, they did not eat humans, but rather they were pitiable creatures. So the thing is that you wouldn't have been afraid of the zombies so much as you would have been afraid of the witch doctor. You would have been much more terrified by the idea of being turned into a zombie yourself. And it's only really once the myth begins to evolve in cinema that other elements, and many of which are, as we'll probably get into later, cross-contaminated with the vampire legend, that the zombie develops a taste for human flesh and becomes contagious. So yes, basically, in a nutshell, the zombie carries with it a heavy load, one that is about slavery, colonialism, and occupation.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response, Professor Lauro. My next question is, the new colonial occupation of Haiti occurs around the same time as the Spanish flu pandemic. And roughly 100 years later, we have the COVID plague. During this entire span, the zombie too has metamorphosed into this idiosyncratic diseased body. Why is the zombie contagious, at least to us?
Right. Well, so as I've just alluded to, most film scholars say that the contagious zombie really begins with the films of George Romero in the 60s and 70s. But I think that you actually do see hints of contagion in the earlier films. So even those early voodoo zombies, have a kind of wraith of contagion as well, because there are a lot of narratives of going native. So these would be stories in which a white character has traveled to the colonies and they become sort of mixed up in black magic. So there's a bit of contagion already there. Of course, we might also think of the deep association with colonialism and disease, things like smallpox, cholera, yellow fever. So for me, the underlying similarity between the original voodoo zombie and the contagious zombie is always colonization. We can think of the ways that disease is imagined as a kind of colonization of the body, for example. And then there's also a long-standing association of cannibalism with colonialism. So in just one example, people often used cannibalism as a justification for colonialism, saying we need to go and we need to civilize these people. But also in a way, colonialism is a kind of cannibalization of another people. So it may be that even though most film scholars will say Romero invents the contagious zombie, I would argue that these elements were in fact already present in earlier incarnations of the myth.
Thank you so much. Since you're raising the question of magic, so why do you think there has been a conversion from sorcery into tropes of sickness, consumerist malfunctions, terrorist invasions, drug-related deaths, technophobia to manifest the on-screen zombie? In the on-screen zombie is such a huge weight. Why do you think this happened?
I think this is such an important question, and one that's really often overlooked. I would say that we always have to be careful to recognize the Haitian zombie as a larger part of the voodoo cosmology. So there have been some scholars like the Harvard scientist Wade Davis who have attempted to explain the zombie's reanimation as a purely pharmacological phenomenon. So he went to Haiti and researched the witch doctor potion that they were using and sort of argued that it was a composite of paralytic poisons, which would give the appearance of death, and then narcotics to keep the reanimated victim in a kind of subdued state, effectively making a zombie, but through only chemical reactions. But I think that we should never dismiss the fact that for many Haitians, zombies are a spiritual phenomenon, and I never want to elide that or overwrite that phenomenon. Now, to the second part of your question about the fact that this metaphor was twisted and taken up and came to signify different things, I think that the easy way to look at this, and in fact, the way I was looking at this when I first began my research, was as an appropriation of the myth, right? This word appropriation is very, very popular in the United States, especially. But what I learned in Haiti was that it's actually not that simple. And I was really struck when I was traveling in Haiti on my book. I was aware that there was another way of looking at this. So I sort of went to Haiti with this idea that my book was going to be about this appropriation of the myth by the United States especially, and now by countries all over the world making zombie films. But what I learned, what I was told, informed by Haitians, was that they saw it a little bit differently. And there were Haitians who would take pride in the spread of the myth and saying, no, it's not you who have taken the zombie. It's not you who have appropriated the zombie. You have become enchanted by it. And I just found that so powerful. And it's always reminded me that there is sort of an underside to the coin of appropriation. And through that lens, we can see that there's sort of a counter-colonization happening in that narrative of the myth of the zombie, that the Haitian can say, you have not appropriated anything. You have been enchanted by us. You have been invaded by our mythology. And I just thought that was so beautiful and so powerful.
That's a lovely way of putting it. But again, do you think with the Haitian zombie or what the United States have appropriated, do you think the zombies have over time become symbols of resistance, right from agelessness? You know, if you see the zombies not age, to perennial waiting, they're constantly waiting for food or some kind of, they're constantly stuck in this limbo, if you can put it that way, insatiable hunger. Yeah, insatiable.
Yes.
Yeah, asexual production, if you see that, because they bite off each other and then another zombie is born. So do you think, to a body which refuses to die or decay any further, so how do you read zombies as, resistant figures that way?
Well, yeah, this is a very deep and complex question. And I apologize if I'm speaking very fast, but just to let your listeners know that I'm out here on my porch, as you can see, because I don't have very good Wi-Fi anywhere in the house. And so this is, for me, a race against my computer battery. So I'm trying to get through as many points as I possibly can. I have spoken with many people who find a kind of resistive potential in the zombie. And for me, it's one that has a potential only because of Haiti, because of its association. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
It has a resistive potential because of its association with Haiti and slave rebellion. But I think if we just look at the zombie as a figure itself, ultimately it is a rotting corpse and a rotting, stinking corpse. So for me, I've never been fully convinced that it's a successful image of resistance. I feel like the zombie gropes towards it, but because there's such a paucity of examples where the zombie is returned to consciousness, even in the Haitian zombie, if a zombie tastes salt, for example, it will return to a dead state. There are a few exceptions in recent films, like the romantic comedy Warm Bodies, where zombies actually get back to their conscious state of before. But in most cases, the zombie's only escape is deanimation. So for me, I have never been convinced that it's an entirely successful symbol of resistance, but more I read it as a kind of lament of the people's powerlessness, because it's always at the same time a reminder of slavery and slave resistance. But I don't think that you can uncouple either one of those. And so that's evident even in some of the zombie literature from the Duvalier dictatorship. So I know that there are others who want to see the zombie as a persistence as a resistive model, especially in terms of queer theory, and as you were suggesting, kind of an asexual reproduction, but I've never been fully convinced that it's an entirely satisfying image of resistance.
Thank you so much. What is also interesting to note is that that against the emptied city under emergency, a metaphor for modern alienation, of course, the way we see it, the zombies are always found in clusters, united. Do you think this is the emergence of the oppressed some way? So are we in the zone of Marx then? The factories stop during incursion. So in a very comic way perhaps, but I don't know, the factories stop, there is no production and there is nothing but the zombies and the cities are, locked down, like the COVID lockdown.
Right, like COVID lockdown. That's fascinating, actually. I'll have to think more about COVID as a kind of important obstruction of capitalism. I haven't really thought about that yet. But yes, I think this is a very interesting question, because the zombie outbreak can be imagined as a kind of disruption of capitalism. But then again, zombie landscapes are always dystopias where everything is in disorder. And I've tried to think, I can't think of any zombie narrative where the worker, seizes the means of production. So I'm not sure that Marx would completely approve of the zombie as such a figure. And in fact, the zombie's cannibalism is closer to Marx's use of the vampire that feeds off of others as an image of those who profit off of the labor of other people. So although it's true, and I've written about this in Zombie Theory, which is a good collection that I put together if other people are now, interested in just seeing all the different ways that other scholars have looked at the zombie. Like if you just think of in films, you'll have a scene where people, the most famous Dawn of the Dead, where they go into a shopping mall and now everything is free because there's no longer any, and money has no value. Or you think of a scene like in 28 Days Later, where they go into the human survivors go into the grocery store and now they're just taking everything that they want. There are these moments of important post-capitalist fantasy. And so there is this kind of imagination of an end to capitalism as we know it. But again, I think this is not a fully satisfying image because it so often has, terrible things that are happening around it. Often the military and the kind of malfeasance of the military will become a part of those same zombie narratives.
Right. So, as you said, it becomes increasingly difficult to bracket or define the zombies, right? So, especially the cannibalistic character. So, are they like any other deadly virus, erasing the places they inhabit? Again, let's say like the COVID virus or like Ebola. So, is it simply a matter of non-violent sustenance in the animal kingdom? Do we compare zombies with animals? And animals are not violent; it's just their way of sustaining themselves. Or is it the primordial fear of in humans of the cannibals that perhaps they once were, the desire of tasting the other's flesh, the other that is also the self?
Yeah, I do think it is important that this is a deep and complicated question, actually, because is the zombie really human or is it not human? But I think fundamentally that the cannibalism is important as cannibalism. I will have to think more about zombies as animals. I've only just recently started, I have a piece I'm working on with an animal studies scholar, and we're writing a piece together on Black cinema and animals. So this is something I'll continue to chew on as an idea, no pun intended. But I think at bottom, the fear of cannibalism is a reflection of colonialism and then a reflection of capitalist society. It's the fear of the fact that we're feeding off of other people. I mean, Abraham Lincoln had a wonderful line in one of his presidential addresses where he was describing slavery as wringing your bread from the sweat of another man's brow. And I just have always come back to that kind of image of slavery as a kind of actual consuming of the body of another person. Now, the virus is a whole different entity because viruses are not quite human. So if I was to think more about this, we might actually find that viral zombies belong in a slightly different category, one where we find the dead colonized by other species or other creatures. So for example, there's a little pocket of zombie movies where it's an alien invasion that takes over, and those aliens reincarnate the humans and make them into zombies. So for example, Plan 9 from Outer Space, or the 1978 film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which are not exactly zombies, but they're still doing similar work in that there's a colonization of the body by a distinctly different force and an erasure of its original agency. So I guess my answer to that, in short, is that I think that the cannibalism is the most terrifying thing. I mean, we don't have the interest in films where dogs are attacking people, for instance. So I don't think it's just about being consumed, though that is terrifying, but it's specifically about being consumed by someone who is like you, being consumed by another human.
Right. Very interesting. So again, coming back to the aspect of sense, or that aspect of touch. So zombies are not insensate, and yet they lack consciousness. So is it? Do you think it's a challenge to the deliberately humanist misreading that happens when we look at them? So isn't the sight of the zombie an attack, a challenge to our deconstruction of image as a whole? So what are they actually? So they're of course agender. So they're the Frankensteinian monster, not the miraculous Lazarus, which comes back from the dead. They are animal, but they're also a disabled body. Do you think these narratives could be found in? I don't remember reading a zombie as a disabled body, because we are constantly pushed away by the way they walk, the way they look. So do you think there's also some kind of empathetic reading which is possible when we look at the zombie?
Oh, there's so much to unpack in this question. I mean, one thing I would point to is that, surprisingly to me, there's an entire book collection called Zombies and Sexuality that takes up this question of the gender or lack of gender, but also and its reproduction, its asexual reproduction of itself through its bite. So even though has not been my interest in the myth, because I'm specifically interested in it as it relates to Haiti, slavery, colonialism, I would point other people to that book, Zombies and Sexuality, or I address it briefly in Zombie Theory in my composite collection. And I don't think we have done as much with the animal in that collection, but disability certainly. There is a discussion of zombies as disabled bodies. But the place where I can really intervene in this conversation is talking about the lack of consciousness, which we started out with. So I always have to remind people that zombies are different than the Frankensteinian monster or than Lazarus, as you suggested, because they don't have consciousness. So yes, it's a disruption of the humanist binary for me of subject-object. Now, another wrinkle, though, is that they may attain a kind of swarm identity in place of the individual identity. And that would be, I think, the closest we come to using the zombie as a revolutionary model. So you see that in some films like Land of the Dead or World War Z, where the zombies are not thinking as individuals, they're sort of thinking as a horde. But I think that this aspect has yet to be fully developed in zombie films. The collectivity of the horde is certainly a kind of revolutionary model, but I think it's perhaps less revolutionary if that horde is only driven to consume. It ends up being caught in this feedback loop that ultimately keeps mirroring capitalist consumption. So I would propose, what if the horde instead protected itself and its fellows? To me, that would be more revolutionary. And I do think you see that not in a zombie text, but in The Last Man on Earth, I Am Legend, some of those earlier texts which actually inspired Romero.
Also in Land of the Dead as well, right? Where the black leader,
Yes, that is absolutely one of the counter examples, but I don't think it was taken up by as many people and pushed forward as an important trope in the zombie myth. I would like to see people develop that more.
Right. This one is perhaps what I'm also trying to develop on. So, do you think the zombies are redefining and redetermining the character and the political functions of dead bodies? That dead bodies are not silent forms, but substantial performers. Not that just not things that go underground or are cremated or burned, but things that can perform as well.
I mean, absolutely. Our thinking is very much in line because there was a time when I really wanted to write a whole book just on this, but I was looking for a job at that moment. And my mentor said to me, "You've already written a book about zombies. If you write a book about corpses, no one's going to hire you." So I got off on a different project. But yes, I think that what the zombie reminds us is that we will all have a life beyond death, but it won't be one that's satisfying from the point of view of individual consciousness. Instead, the body will be alive with decay. It's going to remain a kind of economy of microorganisms. But in fact, actually already, we are alive with multiple bacteria in our bodies. We're not actually this singular entity that we pretend we are, right? So as a corpse, though, your body will be left to fuse with its surroundings. It's going to feed other species. So yes, definitely there is a kind of living deadness of the corpse itself. And another thing I think is interesting to consider is the way that corpses can actually do literal labor beyond their own death. So I was thinking when I was proposing that book of talking specifically about the bodies of political martyrs or medical cadavers, for example, bodies that actually do work beyond death. Or now that I'm really interested in slave revolt, when they executed a leader of a slave rebellion, they would leave his head or his whole body on display as a kind of warning to other slaves. Well, that's a corpse that is doing labor beyond its own life. So in short, it may be that zombies are so terrifying because they hold a mirror up to us, not only in terms of its social function as making these commentaries upon capitalist greed and colonialism, but also in terms of our basic ontology, that we are always at the same time living and dead already. I have dead tissue in my body right now. I have bacterial organisms flowing through me.
I'll come to the aspect of the post-human later on, but just because you mentioned the performance of the dead body and how they go underground and still they keep intertwining with the bacteria and with worms. Do you think it's closer somewhere? I don't know if I'm leaping too hard. So do you think it's somewhere close to Donna Haraway's aspect of the post-human as a compost?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
in fact, there already has been work done on this, so I haven't taken it up specifically because someone like Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has written very well on this, on a kind of, I think he calls it a gray ontology, this kind of in-betweenness of the corpse. And I would refer people to that work. It's really good. But yeah, I think that definitely has potential as a post-human trope or identity.
Right. So what, according to you, makes the zombies so real? From China's, these are some historical evidences. So from China's Xinhua news agency convincing people that Ebola is not a zombie disease, to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention publishing an article in 2011 on how to prepare for a zombie invasion. And finally, of course, we have Max Brooks's Zombie Survival Guide. So is it solely the force of pop culture and Hollywoodization, do you think, which makes the zombies real?
No, I think the zombie is so real because it speaks so deeply to us on so many different levels. I think the zombie myth is terrifying from all of these different angles. So it's almost as if there's something for everyone. No matter what you're afraid of, the zombie can sort of incarnate that or can metaphorize that. And I think that I have often heard people say, oh, it's because, and this is a complicated sort of sidebar, but the capitalization upon the image of zombies, as in Hollywood, is another thing that you have to take into consideration. It's almost as if capitalism saw the zombie myth as a threat and sought to kind of reclaim it in the Hollywoodization. But I would say that what's really ensured the zombies' longevity in cinema are several different aspects. There's the fear of losing one's individuality or agency. And for me, that's a reflection of the colonial subject, but it could also just be a reflection of fears of death. There's the fear of being consumed by others. And for me, that speaks most deeply to this reflection of capitalist abuses, which we've already talked about. But then I think there's also just the fear, because of these apocalyptic wasteland films, of the breakdown of society, which appear especially in zombie films. And for me personally, in most zombie films, the most terrifying creatures are not the living dead, but they're actually the humans of this. They're the survivors who put themselves first and refuse to help their fellow survivors. So I think a recent film like Train to Busan, but even going back to Night of the Living Dead, you'll have these humans who do not want to help other people, who are interested in consolidating power, who are interested above all else in their own survival. And to me, that's the most terrifying thing and the most real, because it's that every man for himself mentality that is, to me, the most terrifying. And I think in a way, the humans in those zombie films become more awful even than the living dead that are clawing at the door trying to get in. And obviously that every man for himself mentality is all too real in our society.
Also, do you think that the entire representation of zombie has become a problem? Because till very recently it was restricted to Hollywood, but now it's spilling over, right? So the Koreans have their own set of zombies. Even in Bengali cinema, we have the zombie coming in Indian cinema. So do you think there is a problem with representation, or there might be a problem with representation? Do you think of the
well,
zombie?
I need to know more about these Bengali zombies, because I have not heard of that before or looked into it at all. But yeah, I mean, well, it's a little complicated because, for one thing, in really tracing the zombies' origins to Haiti and then back to Africa, I've been very interested in one kind of living dead. And there are many other examples, like the Chinese hopping ghost. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I would be a disaster. But there, every culture, or there's the European revenant. There's many different figurations of living death. But for me, I've only been interested in tracing this one that's really related to slavery and colonialism. Though you're right, the zombie has now expanded beyond that. In our globalized world, we are sharing these different mythologies, and they may take on different resonances for different people. I mean, I was thinking that an easy answer to this question would be something about the adaptability of virus and the spread of virus, right? That this myth is spreading like a virus, that there's also this concern that maybe the virus will outpace us in its evolution, so that even if we were to come up with a vaccine, it would evolve too swiftly, and then it would be different, and it would become immune to the disease. But I think that probably the most interesting aspect of the acceleration of the zombie has been its reflection of technological advancements in society. There's a couple of things I have going through my head at the same time, and I want to try to clarify what I mean here. On the literal level, the zombie becomes quicker, becomes more fast, more powerful, when we have a stronger embrace of this idea of the viral zombie. So even though the film 28 Days Later never said the word zombie, and it wasn't originally considered a zombie film, we've now embraced this as a zombie film. But the victims of the rage virus in that film don't actually die and reanimate, they just turn. So because when we have these zombies that don't actually have to have rigor mortis set in, you can have a swifter and more powerful zombie. But I also have a second point on this, which I think that at bottom, the zombie's evolution probably signals to the fact that we're developing these technologies at such a swift rate that they outpace our moral compass. And so if we think perhaps of Facebook, we create these technologies and we're not even really aware of what we may be unleashing. And so I think that the zombie is a kind of image for that, because so often in zombie narratives, we'll have like a scientific breakthrough that then accidentally leads to the zombie apocalypse. We're creating these technologies, or we're making these things that we think are going to be improvements, and they end up unleashing this terrible global pandemic. So I think that's my answer to your question.
Right. So yeah, so taking the cue from you, there was this very recent film, I think in 2019. It's called Little Joe, and it shows. Yeah, it shows this genetically manipulated and engineered flour, which can bring happiness. So it does bring happiness, but it also changes the primary character of the person who smells it, right? And they keep referring to each other, the changed character as a zombie. Do you think the zombie has become has become a metaphor rather than a full form dead body? There has been a change.
Oh, well, I think the zombie was a metaphor from its inception, from the very first soul capture mythologies. I think that it was very, very clearly a metaphor for slavery. But I have to confess, I have not seen this movie, Little Joe, though I will definitely look it up. and then maybe I'll send you my thoughts on it. So yeah, that's something I haven't thought about before.
All right. So again, let's come to the zombies' adaptability. That's an entire segment on that, because we have this zombies gradually becoming like us, the living people. So, for example, they're learning language and rebellion in Land of the Dead, and developing speed in Shaun of the Dead or Train to Busan. So, if identity is based on difference, so how do we comprehend this ontological crisis between us and them?
I mean, I think that we are in an ontological crisis. I think since the moon landing. So, I mean, one signal moment in the popularity of the zombie was Night of the Living Dead, right? Which came out in 1969, right around the time of the moon landing, which was portrayed interestingly in that recent series, The Queen. Nothing to do with zombies, but I think that there was a certain existential crisis to humanity around that. Well, if we are not the people of this planet, if we can go to the moon, what are we? And so there was, in Night of the Living Dead, I would say that's one sort of, if you were to track the zombies' popularity, that's sort of one flashpoint that stands out. And then a lot of people look at the what we call the boom of zombies in the new millennium. In the beginning of the 21st century, we had so much interest in the zombie all of a sudden. And most people, myself included, look to economic reasons, to an economic downturn for the zombie. But I think that another reason might just be more simply the turning over of the calendar, and the sense of like, are we beyond history? What are we doing as a people? Are we really making the world better? Or are all these technologies that we surround ourselves with actually making us less human? I mean, you know, in a better world, I would have liked to be with you guys in person, but obviously over this technology, I'm a disembodied figure. You see my image, but you don't really know where I am or who I am. So I think that we are reckoning with our own sort of existential crisis of what makes us human, really.
Right. So again, in your book, when you're calling the zombie a post-human, are you post-human, of course? So are you referring to humanism's refusal to vanish because they are trudging on and walking or are you referring to the Vitruvian model, which has degenerated and yet it continues to walk the roads?
Right. I don't think that we were looking at the Vitruvian model at all. Now that that essay is more than 10 years old. But specifically what we were talking about in the Zombie Manifesto was that we were signaling to the fact that the zombie refuses the both and operation of the Cyborg Manifesto. So obviously the Cyborg Manifesto from the 1980s was a very important a signal text, and it proposed that we could undo the humanist binaries like subject, object, male, female, human, non-human, by an act of incorporation, by a sort of plus symbol, by a multiplicity. But it seemed to me and my co-author, Karen Embry, that the both and model was actually insufficient for the post-human because it too often retained ultimately the individual subject position. And so what we were trying to do was think in a negation rather than an assertion. And so we wanted to put forth the zombie and the zombie's living deadness as a kind of neither nor model rather than both and. And we felt that because the zombie is at bottom, it's not subject or object. It's not individual or really collectivity, I would even argue. Even in some of these films like Land of the Dead, maybe that's the best example. But because the zombie is really just driven by its own hunger for itself. And like I said earlier, we don't see that many zombies protecting each other. So I think that that's what we were thinking when we were talking about it, was really this neither nor rather than both and proposal that we might reach more of a truly post-human state through that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lauro. So my next question is, so opposing the human then, we don't have the technological other anymore. So rather the zombie undead other. So it raises an ontic subject haunting our consciousness and sets up this philosophical and mortal fear of life after death, of afterlife after death, of the non-human in us, of surviving not as a machinic body, but as a bestial other. So opposed to technological transhumanism, do you consider the zombie more of an ethical, philosophical problem?
Yeah, I think that that's exactly it. So I was suggesting earlier, but might not have fully articulated, that a further problem to explore might be whether we aren't already zombies. And so let me just take a moment to explain what I mean by that. So we did touch upon how we're always a composite of living and dead tissues, but even agency has been proven by neuroscientists to basically be a fiction, right? Are we really conscious of everything that we do? Am I really in command of my body, or is it outside of my control? If my kidneys are failing, I can't say to my kidneys, work, right? And even when I am typing, my fingers know where to go. But if you were to tell me, okay, sit down and write a keyboard and tell me where all of the keys are, I would not be able to do that. So in what sense are we subjects? Does subjectivity mean that we have to understand that we are agentic in every moment? Because clearly we're really not agentic over all the different aspects of our being. So I think that what the zombie laid bare for us was that this has maybe always been a false choice, this subject-object divide. And that's what we were hoping to point to with the zombie. I see that some people are writing in the chat, and I wish that I had time to look at it. I'm hoping that after our session is concluded, I can go back. And I will also say that I'm on Twitter. I don't know if some of the people joining here are on Twitter, but I'm on Twitter as Zombie Scholar. And if anybody has questions or wants to continue the conversation after this, I would be very happy to talk further about this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lauro, for being so cooperative and kind. There's a very interesting observation by Deborah Christie in your book Better Off Dead, that zombies and zombie films refer to Plato's theory of anamnesis. So it is a form of, I'm quoting Deborah Christie here, that it's a form of social vaccination that revisits the horror of disease or trauma in order to prepare the social body for some future contamination or event, unquote. So my question is, do you think we could have prepared ourselves better against COVID-19 had we listened to the zombies, because we have been dosed with so much of the virus.
Yeah.
And yet we were so unprepared.
Yeah, we were so unprepared. I mean, one thing I have to say is that, maybe Deborah Christie would be more equipped to exactly talk about what she meant by that line and what she was thinking. But personally, no, I don't feel like we've learned the lessons that the zombie narratives have to teach us. And I feel like it might be especially heightened. If we're talking to a scholar in New York, they might have a completely different perspective, because New York was very strong on COVID-19. Its numbers are now the lowest in the country. But I'm coming to you from Florida, where people are not taking this pandemic seriously. I'm lowering my voice as I'm outside on the porch and see my neighbors. But in Florida now, we're headed towards another peak, and things are getting out of control. When I drive through town, I see people walking around without masks. Stores are open, bars are open, and now we're going to face the consequences of that. So yeah, I think that the zombie provided some lessons for us, but it does indeed seem that we failed to heed those warnings. I will share with you, just as a fun way of, so I often think about what have I learned from all of the zombie movies that I've watched. Some of them quite bad, not the classics, but the B movies from the 50s and 60s. And so here are the three things that I've learned about how to deal with the apocalypse, and I just share them as a bit of fun. Number one is stockpile antibiotics. So anytime your doctor gives you antibiotics and then you don't end up needing them, keep them. Because I think if the zombie apocalypse really comes, or any kind of apocalypse comes, and doctors are shut down, hospitals are at capacity, many more people are going to die of just your basic infections. So it won't only be the catastrophe, it's going to be other things. I also, because I live in Florida and every year we face hurricane season, because of all of those zombie movies where people are boarding up a house hoping to prevent it from zombies getting inside, I learned how to be very efficient at boarding up a house with plywood. And then my final lesson is that I told my kids when this pandemic was hitting and they were getting very scared, I said, you don't really have to worry until the news goes off the air. Because as we see in Dawn of the Dead, The first scene of that movie is the news anchors stop running the news because they're going to go take care of themselves. And so I feel like this is just, a bit of silliness, but those are the things I've learned from zombies. We should have been better prepared for this. The CDC had even put out a zombie apocalypse guide, like how to be prepared, which was obviously a joke, but also just talking about preparedness for catastrophe in general. But obviously, we have not heeded the warnings.
Right. And of course, my last question is, so could we end with the evolutionary process of the post-zombie narratives? Do you think the zombie representation is slowly reaching its limit? Do you think what is after this zombie we are so adjusted to seeing?
Yeah, so I want to take I want to break off one piece of the zombie popularity that was really, really fascinating to me, that I wrote a whole chapter in my book, The Transatlantic Zombie, about, and that was the zombie walk phenomenon. So from 2003 to about 2010, there was this massive phenomenon. It was global. There were events in New Zealand. There were events all throughout Europe. There were events in South America. I don't know if there were any in India. I would love to hear from you if there were. But the zombie walk phenomenon was a thing where people would appoint a place and a time, and then they would show up dressed as zombies for no reason. And they would just congregate as zombies. And 1 week a city would set a world record, and then the next week that record for most zombies in one area would be overturned. I was fascinated by this event. I thought, why is this happening? I mean, this has to show us that this mythology of the living corpse is speaking so profoundly to people that they want to spend their Saturday acting as a zombie. So, well, let me break off. Did you see any events like that in India?
No, there weren't any events. No,
okay.
No, sadly, no.
Okay. Yeah. But I was so interested in this because I felt like, okay, what are these really but a kind of dress rehearsal for revolution? I thought right now this is playful, right? They're doing this for no real reason, but there's also a kind of undercurrent to it. They're basically telling the people in power, if we wanted to, we could organize, we could congregate, we could form these big collectives. So for me, I argued that it was like a dress rehearsal for real social praxis. So even though those events didn't have a political message, they were to me kind of like the zombies' wordless moan. They were sort of an empty signifier, just expressing dissatisfaction, but not really having a message. So to go back to your question, I argued at that time that I thought that this phenomenon would fall off when we started to see real social change, real people arguing for actual things they wanted done. And in fact, I feel now that my thesis has been tested, because in the United States, as you're aware, we have a lot of social and civil unrest because of the murder of our Black citizens by police officers. And I've been to some, carefully wearing a mask, social distancing, but I have attended some Black Lives Matter protests, and I have not seen any zombies at these events. So for me, this signals to the fact that that the zombie walk phenomenon was a kind of placeholder for when people were wanting real social change. And I think now that we have an interest, we have a message that we're trying to send, we no longer have the need for that zombie imagery in that sense. But that said, I still do think that the zombie is going to have real staying power in cinema, and that its popularity is going to ebb and flow, as I've already seen just in, almost 15 years that I've been studying it. We will see little dips and little rises that are going to mirror what's going on with society. But I think that the myth itself, or the metaphor itself, is malleable enough that it's going to continue to absorb and reflect new cultural concerns and tensions. So I think, and at bottom, I think that the zombie is still going to be relevant as long as we have certain people who are oppressing other people, certain people who are taking over control of the lives of other people. Because for me, that's what the zombie has always been about, dating back to the transatlantic slave trade.
And now that you've referred to Black Lives Matter, I was also preparing a paper myself, was thinking of writing a paper myself, that I was, has there ever been a perfect metaphor where, the city is under lockdown and the city is empty and people are coming out and there's disruption? And I think it's a perfect zombie metaphor. I mean, has there ever been a classic metaphor before this, because there are no people and nothing
Right.
but people, dead as if you consider identity, black people who are, in the margin. So like the zombies, and they're
Right.
coming to the center.
Right. No, in fact, I mean, I would encourage you. So one thing that might be of interest to some of our listeners here is that I am the editor of a journal called Studies in the Fantastic. And this kind of thing you're proposing is definitely an essay that we would want to consider for publication. So, and it's in the journal, we publish anything on film, on fiction, on video games. I'm especially interested in video games. I just had a new book come out that's on video games about slave revolt, called Kill the Overseer. But yeah, maybe you have another place in mind, but I would love to see someone develop an idea on Black Lives Matter and COVID and the zombie metaphor all crystallizing in this moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response. Amazing responses. So can we take the questions now? Maybe 10 minutes for the question. Yeah. So I think we have one question from Obiru Bhattacharya. I think his question is on the stereotypical representation of zombies. He wants to ask, why are the zombies always, stereotypically represented as, eating corpses or becoming corpses, or this grotesque physicality or physiognomy associated with them. So I think his question is rather on the generalization of the image of the zombie.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep and important question. I think that I would pick out of that larger question the idea that we only just skirted around, which was of disability and of the diseased body and disability. And I would really say to that person that there's much more work to do on that. Obviously, there has been work, but not enough work on zombies and the homeless. So I think that the image of the rotting body is an image of a person who is disempowered, who is not even really considered a person anymore, right? Just as like the scary thing about humanity is that at some point I'm going to become a thing. When I become a corpse, I will cease to be a person and I will become an object. And so I think that the subject objectness of the zombie, or the weird muddledness of it, is a way that it can metaphorize those people in our society who are not quite considered human. So be they the homeless, be they the disabled who are not given rights and access that they need, be they in our culture today, African Americans who are not given the same rights as white Americans. So I would just say this is a good area to think about, and more work needs to be done, especially on the homeless. I don't know what kind of a homeless I don't know what kinds of care you have for the homeless in India, but it's certainly something we need to think more about in the United States, and the mentally insane as well.
Right. Thank you so much. There is one question from Meenakshi Verma. She asks, has there always been different types of zombies, or is it the culture industry which is trying to bring in a different variety of it? Do we have different kinds of zombies, or is it always the same zombie we're looking at? I think that's what she wants to ask. Yeah.
Well, there has definitely been a kind of split among the zombie. In fact, there's a scholar named Kevin Boone who tried to do a taxonomy of the zombie and categorize 9 different kinds of zombies. So one is the technological zombie. The viral zombie would be a different zombie in his iteration. But I also am really interested in the way that we just collapse all of these living dead into the term zombie. And I think that I personally don't like that. So for example, some of the films of Lucio Fulci, the Italian horror director, to me, those living dead, they're often raised by a priest from the dead. To me, and they are very much steeped in like images of Catholicism and Christianity. To me, that would not be a zombie proper. They're sort of in a different category. So I think there's 2 parts here. One is absolutely, yes, the zombie has come to take on all of these different significations in a way that has sort of multiplied what we consider a zombie. But I always want to make sure that when I'm using the term zombie, I'm really using it in terms of this tracing of the mythology from the United States to Haiti and the Caribbean to Africa, and deeply being about slavery and resistance.
Right. There's one question from Anubhav Chakraborty. He asks, are zombies the degree 0 of human consciousness, or can they be equated as a rupture in the Eurocentric meta-narrative of selfhood?
I mean, I think definitely the idea of the rapture goes to what I was just saying as a kind of different, a different iteration or something that I like to leave aside. You know, every Easter in the United States, people will tweet Happy Jesus Zombie Day. And I always feel like I need to remind them that Jesus was not a zombie. A resurrection is not the same as a zombie. So I think at the heart of this question is an idea about consciousness. And I think that that's so important. I even have mixed feelings about when people will have they'll call something a zombie movie, but you have a zombie who's thinking, who's feeling. There was a mockumentary, I think called American Zombie, where they were interviewing zombies and saying, you know, you're the oppressed minority in American society. But for me, it is absolutely fundamental to the zombie that they not be fully conscious. And that was, we touched on that a little bit with your question about Frankenstein and Lazarus, I think. So yeah, the lack of consciousness is fundamental, I think.
Right. There's a question from Ishita Lahiri who says, in Totem and Taboo, Freud talks of the touch phobia. So she asks, is there a way we can reconcile the zombie myth with the psychoanalytic theory of taboo?
I think that's fascinating. I personally have not thought about that at all. And I've thought about this for a long time. So I would, this is something that I think should be developed more. I mean, and it actually could maybe be, this might be the right moment for it, because what we are experiencing is, because of COVID, a newfound fear of touch, fear of the outsider, fear of the other. I mean, we wear our masks. I reached out to shake someone's hand at the beginning of this and could see the look of terror on their face and thought, oh yeah, that's right. We're not supposed to be touching each other anymore. So, so maybe that would provide a good entry point into saying why we need to reinvestigate the zombie as a fear of touch and contamination from the outside. I think that's a very interesting angle on the subject.
Right. I think we'll just take two more questions. One is from Shoham Dev Shorkar. He wants to ask, with the surge of zombie literature, is it pushing humanity away from the myth or towards it?
Well, yeah, I've sort of felt like that's my, I mean, the other thing that your listeners should know is I'm not the only zombie scholar. There are many other people who are writing interesting, fascinating work on this. And so that's why I created the collection Zombie Theory, to just put some of the best essays together. And also there's an extensive selection of further readings on the zombie. But sorry, I forgot the question, the kernel of the question.
Yeah, are they pushing humanity away from
towards
the myth?
The myth? Yeah. I think, so I have felt like my job was always to remind people of the myth. I think that, yeah, the questioner is absolutely right, that people feel like the zombie was reinvented by Americans, that now we have this American zombie, that we no longer need to look back to Haiti. And so my job has always been to remind people, no, you do. You absolutely do, because it's the same. First of all, there's the actual lines that we can trace historically and even geographically in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. But I don't think that the content of slavery and slave rebellion that's endemic to the original zombie can ever be fully evacuated. So I have felt like that was my role to play, among other zombie scholars, was to remind people to always look back to the original myth.
Okay, so we have so many questions. The last question we'll take is from Gaurav Ghosh. I think he wants to ask, is the global zombie representative of the lack of order in human society? Because he says he has never seen a film where there is actually cosmos reigning and the zombie comes and disrupts it. There's always chaos. I think that's what he wants to ask. Is it representative of the inherent chaos that is there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the only text that comes to my mind would be the BBC show In the Flesh. And this is a show where there's a couple of shows that sort of take place after, or movies that take place after the zombie apocalypse has gotten under control. But I think you're absolutely right that it is a fear of chaos deeply. It's about a fear of lack of disorder. But I do think there are some exceptions, as with, you know, almost every aspect of the zombie myth. There are some exceptions where we have a society that has reinstated order. It's often usually undergirded by a kind of military, almost martial law. And then we're seeing how the society is coping in the aftermath of that, or even with letting zombies reintegrate into society. So, I mean, my answer would be, well, that's not properly a zombie if they've then attained a kind of reconsciousness.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lauro, for this fascinating session on zombies and diseased bodies.
It's been my pleasure, and we'll have to follow up. I would like a list of Bengali zombie movies that I need to watch, and I'll be happy to send you my notes to make your work with transcription easier.
Absolutely, and I'll also contact you with the publication thing. I'll also contact you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for your questions and everything. Really, really great thinking happening here on this chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Lauro. Hope to be in touch. Bye-bye.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
absolutely.
Bye-bye. Yeah.